Hello everyone and welcome to Rebelway. My name is Andrew Sutherland and today we're going to be creating this fire monster effect. So there's a couple concepts going on in this project. So to start off, I'm going to define what a cross product is. Then we're going to build a cross product tool that you can use in your projects. And after that, we're going to dive into the final project that we see here. So concept one is obviously the cross product, which I'll talk about in a moment. But the second thing is using a flip simulation as our emitter. So if we take a look at this comparison between our standard pyro simulation and one that has a flip simulation driving some extra density, flame, and velocity. So when we've got something like a flamethrower, for instance, the source of a flamethrower is gasoline, and as you can, if you take a look closely here, this just feels way more dynamic than this one. As you can see, there's bits of almost looks like gasoline is falling down, then it's combusting and burning and raising. So if we look here, you can imagine this is almost like our petrol or gasoline, and here are our fumes, and here's some velocity. And with that added to our original pyro simulation, we get this effect. But I mentioned the cross product, and the cross product is what we see in these velocities. So I've already made a video explaining the cross product, and we're gonna watch that now. Before we get started, I'm going to explain a maths function that we're going to use throughout this project known as the cross product. And what the cross product is the result of two vectors. In this illustration, we can see vector A and vector B. And this purple vector is the cross product of these two. And the way it's calculated is it looks at the first vector and the second vector, and it computes a virtual plane between these two vectors, and it places the third vector in the center of that plane, and then it moves it to the intersection. So as you can see, vector 1, vector A, vector B, and then this cross product. In order to illustrate that, I'm just going to put down a sphere. But dive inside, I'm going to put down a facet node to compute the normals. And as you can see, we have these vectors. Now, for the second vector, I want to create an upward vector on the sphere. So for that, I'm going to put down a wrangle. And I'm going to say v at n set equals set and these values here represent our x, y, and z. Because we want an upward vector, we're going to put a value of 1 into the y. And as you can see, we now have an upward vector. So let's just put down a null to really drive this point home. And this is our up vector. These are our normals. And if we merge them for illustration purposes, we can see those two vectors. Let's just lower the resolution here. You can see we've got those two vectors there, the normal and the upward vector. And what we want to do is we want to compute the cross product of these two vectors. And so for that, I'm going to put down a VOP, an attribute VOP. I'm just going to put on here. And what we want to do is we want to normalize those vectors by putting down a normalized node, we're just going to make sure our normals values are between 0 and 1. And we're going to put down a cross product. And as you can see, we have our vector 1, which is our normals. And this normal node, this cross product node, already gives us an upward vector. And with that, the cross product of vector 1, vector A, and vector B, we get this result. And to make things a bit more interesting, actually, let's first visualize that result. So we have the upward vector and the normals, and this is our cross product placed here, perpendicular to these two vectors. And to make things more interesting, we can compute the cross product once again with our original result. And now we have this. And if we want, we can mix, put down using a mix node, the results of this and our first result. So that's our original cross product, and then the cross product a second time with the normals. And let's just change this to the rubber toy. Again, we can visualize the mix. And what I want to do is I want to put down a noise. So if I plug this into the P, and just for visualization purposes, let's plug it into the color. So as you can see, we now have this noise pattern applied to our rubber toy. And what I want to do is I want to use this noise to drive the bias of our mix node. And if I visualize that, you can see we now have a result of both of these. And we're going to use a similar setup to this with a bit more control over these parameters. I'm going to use that tool extensively throughout our project. So let's have a look at that tool now. So starting from a new Houdini scene, just going to press D, background, and change our layout to this darker version. And we're going to want to import a character animation. So I'm going to use the test geometry Crag, just because he's already an animated character. And as you can see, if we scroll through, we have Crag animated diving inside of that geometry SOP. We're going to put down a time shift node. We just want to freeze his animation on the first frame. So with that, Crag no longer is animated. We take it back to our first frame. I want to put down a draw curve. Plug that in. And under projection type, we're going to select geometry. With that selected, we can go over and we can start drawing some curves on our character. And we want to just draw along the arms, his head, along his chest, along his legs, Something like that. Next thing what I want to do is I just want to transform those curves to sit with inside the character. So I'm going to put down a transform node. Template our character. Just transform that so those curves sit inside our character, something like that. From there, I just want to blur our light curves a bit. Attrib blur. Remove pin border points. Let's unselect that. And turn up our iterations of just a bit. Something like that. That looks cool. From there, if I click on our visualize points, you can see it's actually quite evenly distributed. But we might want to resample that a bit. But before we do that, let's just put down a polyframe node. And let's compute the tangent name and store that in the N. The normals. Let's resample those points. Yeah, something like that is cool. And let's put down a null. And call that out curve character. So we have our curves, we have a static version of Crag, and we have our original animation. And what we want to do is we want to animate those curves with our animation. So we're going to put down a point deform node. We require our mesh to deform. That's going to be our curves. Our rest position. That's going to be our time shift version. And our original animation. And if we highlight our point deform, those curves will now move with our character. A very important step is to make sure we untick recompute affected normals, because we're going to put a poly wire so we can extrude along these lines, and we don't want to recompute those normals. So let's do that. Let's put down a poly wire. Something like that. We need some more segments. And let's increase the radius. So it looks like he's kind of inside some sort of spacesuit. Something like that. If we play this through, we can see we've got some errors here, and we're just going to untick preserve joint buckling, and that should take care of that. Cool. From there, we're going to put down a VDB from polygons. Lower our resolution, well, increase our resolution, something like that. And we're going to fill interior, and we're going to create an attribute. We're going to use the point in. We're going to give it a custom name. Actually, we're just going to store it in the N here. And we want to compute the velocity. Cool. So now we're using the normals from those polywires, and we converting those normals into the velocity, and we're storing them as N. Let's put down a null. And call that out character field. And if we go back to our original character, we're going to put down a trail node to compute the velocity of that character. Compute velocity. Then we need to create another. Then we need to create an SDF. So VDB from polygons. Lower our resolution once again. Let's put down a null. And call that out character SDF. Next, we need to reshape that volume field or the SDF by putting this to dilate. And we'll just dilate them up a bit, something like that. Next, we need another VDB from polygons. This time, we're going to create a density, click on fill interior. And from there, we're going to put down a VDB analysis node. We're going to compute the gradient of that volume. And we're going to give it a custom name, which we'll store in the val. Put down a null. And call this out character val gradient. Cool. Next, we're going to put down a volume VOP. Our first input is going to be this velocity gradient. The next is going to be our character field. And the third is going to be our SDF. And if we want to visualize what's happening with our velocities, we're going to put down a scatter. A volume trail. Connect that to the first input. And to our volume VOP. I just want to put down another VDB from polygons. Connect that to our character. Point 0.025. Compute the density, fill interior. We're just going to scatter some points inside that volume. Let's turn off relax iteration. And now we can visualize what's happening with our velocities. Cool. So let's work on our velocities a bit. What we want to do is we want to dive into this VOP. We're going to bind import that vel with a bind node. It's a vector vel. And we're going to want to multiply this velocity with a number, a random number that we can control in our scene. So for that, I'm just going to put down a multiply node. And I'm going to attach a parameter. There we go. I'm going to put down a null. We're just going to call this suction. From there, we're going to normalize our velocities. And bind export. Once again, it's a vector. And it's called vel. Of course, our velocities have now disappeared because we're multiplying that number by 0. There's our parameter. So if we turn this up, our velocities come back. Maybe we should give this parameter a name. So let's just call that n. No. So let's just call that mult suction. Cool. Diving back inside that VOP, what we're now going to want to do is we're going to want to compute the cross product. So putting down a cross product, and we're going to take our second input, which is our field here. I'm going to put down a volume sample vector. From the second input, we're going to connect the position to the sample position. We're going to multiply that again with a random number. And let's call that number mult in. Let's put down a null just for organization. Call that in. Let's normalize it. and connect that to our cross product. Cool. Next, we're going to want to get we're going to volume sample our third input, which is our SDF field. Dive back into our VOP. Put down a volume sample node. This time it's a float. So our third input? Third input, sample the position. And we're going to put down a fit range. Set this to -1 and 1. From there, we're going to put down a mix node. We're going to put down a multiply constant. Set to 0. Put that into the second input. And our fit range into the bias. Just forgotten we might want to put another parameter here, so let's put on another multiplier over here. Let's put down another parameter. And we're going to call this mult cross. Cool. From there, we're going to put down an add node. We're going to add our suction. We're going to add our get in. We're going to add our mix. And we're going to multiply that with another bit range. And then I'll fit range 0.05 and minus 0.08 minus 0. And I want to invert these values. Now if we jump back to our VOP, we can see we get a whole bunch of cool swirly velocities. Set this to 6. 1. And something like that. Cool. So as we can see, we now got these velocities that are traveling along those curves that we drew in this sort of tornado-like fashion. Pretty cool. With the explanation and our tool setup, we're going to jump into the final project that we have here. And here we have some motion capture data, our lights, our cameras, and then these nodes are for rendering, which we'll talk about in another tutorial. But the bulk of our simulation is all done inside this FXworks node. I'm going to start here at number 2 with the velocity. If you want to cache all these things out, make sure to cache whatever file caches on in number 1, number 2, number 3, and then number 4 is down here. You need to cache that before jumping into number 5, because number 5 relies, or somewhere down the line relies on the cache from number 4. So make sure you just jump down the network and you don't forget about that. So we're going to start at number 2 in this case, because we're going to skip this lightning effect. And we have this object merge, like I said, importing our character. What we're then doing is we're putting down a draw curve. Now we covered this. This is the exact same setup that we did in our tool creation. So I'm going to briefly just jump through this again. This is just a bit of cleanup because there are some other curves drawn here that are unnecessary. So this blast node is just deleting those unnecessary curves. Again, once again, we're transforming it back. We're blurring those attributes to smooth it out. We're putting down a polyframe, and we're computing the tangent name and storing that in N. From there, we're resampling this just so that we have more points to work with. We have a frozen version, and with that, we have our curves in a frozen version. We can, of course, put down a point deform and deform those curves with our original animation. From there, we're putting down a polywire, which is going to extrude out a VDB from polygons, set to full interior, and we're storing we're computing the velocity and storing that in N. We've covered all this before, and VDB, density, and we're scattering that just so that we can visualize our cross product here. So now This cross product is in Vex, but it's exactly the same tool that we set up in VOPs. So this is just another way of doing it. If you're comfortable with Vex, use the Vex one. If you're comfortable with VOPs, you're welcome to use that. And it's just another variation that we're trying out. On to number 3. Once again, we're object merging in our geometry. Convert node, making sure that we've got polygons, a connectivity with a class attribute. We're transforming our character up. We're slowing down our animation here by taking the frame number $F and we're multiplying that by 2.2. So this is going to be significantly slower, which is going to, when you slow down an animation, it gives the illusion of the character being much larger than it is. So that's why we're doing that. And here, because we've slowed down, we want to jump forward in our animation a bit. So we're just adding 220 frames. That's just going to ensure that our animation starts where we want it. From here, we're doing a polyfill because we've got some holes in our mesh. So if we put down a polyfill, you can see that essentially this mesh is now watertight, which means we can compute an SDF field with a VDB from polygons and VDB reshape. Here we're computing the density with a VDB from polygons. Here we're filling the interior. Here we're computing the gradient and we're storing that in vel. And this is like once again the exact same process we did. And it's just, preparing our geometry for our cross product tool here. So of course, when we visualize that, this is our result. Cool. Jumping over here, we're putting down another polyfill. We're time freezing it. Let's make this a bit bigger. And this time we're filling our character up with points, or our points from volume. So this node basically is like scattering points inside a volume. So that's exactly what we're doing here. And from here we're importing those curves and we're transferring the N onto those points. And I believe the N out character curve and that N attribute is our tangent name. So we're transferring that onto here. And if we dive inside this point VOP, we're preparing two attributes, the emit and emit2. And all we're doing is we're creating a noise onto these points so that some of them can be used and some of them can't. We've got two noises. One of them is at normal speed and one is multiplied down. So this is going to give us a slower flow speed of this noise sort of morphing over our character. Perhaps I should run a flip book. And we have this noise pattern sort of swirling across our character. From there, we're putting that into a pop simulation. We're reading in the velocities into the second input, and our points into the first input. So if I just click on this little brain here, that just means I can jump inside the DOP network without having to wait for it to calculate. We have our pop object. We have an evict by volumes, reading this out velocity, which is outvel 1. That's here. And we're using our first context geometry. That is these points coming in here. So we're sourcing that, and we cache out to disk. So with that, this is our particle simulation, and as you can see, we have these particles swirling around a character. And what we want to do is we want to trail those points. So what this trail node is doing is it's looking at where the particle has been in the previous frame, and just with this trail length, we're sort of tracing back where the particle was, and that's just going to give us 5 times as many particles. And those particles have an ID attribute. So putting down an add node, what we can do is we can put down an add node to connect those particles according to their ID attribute, and we're going to create these like wire-like structures along the path of our particle. So if I turn particles on, we can see where those particles are, and we're resampling them, and that's going to give us even more particles. And then I believe we're using this facet node to remove some of those particles. And this has all been computed on a static geometry. We've time freezed it. We've time frozen our character. And so what we want to do is we now want to deform this simulation like we did previously with a point deform. So here's our animation to deform. This will be our static object, and this is our original animated geometry. So as you can see, it's been frozen on frame 1. We've computed the simulation, and now we want to deform that simulation. And I've cached that out here. So I've just run a flipbook here, and as you can see, we now have that simulation animated according to our original animation. Of course, we're just going to put down a null so we can use that in our pyrosim, or at least prepare it for our pyrosim. If we go down to number 4, we're reading in this null, which is taken from up here, number 3, null 5. It's reading in our gradient, stored as v. Where are we? There we go. And it looks like we've got our sign distance field. We have another cross product tool, and we're just caching that out to disk here. And over here we have a time shift node, clamp to first, and $F. Number 4. Now we need to jump to number 5. 5A. Here we're reading in our character, Polyfill once again, to make sure that we take care of those to make sure that we close our geometry so that we can compute the sign distance field. Yet again, eroding it a bit this time. Here we have our particle sim, and here we have an attribute VOP. And in this attribute VOP, we're just preparing some attributes. We're bind importing that U, which I believe is from our tangent name. Let's go double check that. our particle cache on the resample. It's our curve view attribute. Okay, so this is a really cool attribute that sort of, if we were to, let me put down a draw curve. I put down a draw curve here. I'm just going to resample. And then I'm going to compute this curve view attribute. And if I put down an attribute VOP, we can just visualize curve view and plug that into the C. And as you can see, we have it starting at black and going down to white. So I put down a fit range. We can see we have this cool curve that follows along this path, and we can use that to drive all sorts of things. Pretty cool. So that's the curve view. Where were we? I lost my place for a second there, but we were at this attribute VOP, calc v temp and fuel. And as that name suggests, we're preparing some attributes by importing that curve view, our emitter, and we're using some multiply and fit ranges just to essentially manipulate that data and use that to export val fuel, and temperature. Next, we're going to import the eyes using an object merge, and we're creating two attributes called to delete. But on this version, we have a value of 1, so we're not changing these attributes at all. And on this one, we have a value of 0. And what we're going to do is we're going to transfer that 0 value in the location of the eyes to this area here. And what we're doing in this attribute VOP is we're taking the temperature and we're multiplying it by the two delete attributes. So if these attributes were all 1 and these are 0, and we multiply whatever these attributes were with 0, we're going to get 0. And that way we can just mask out this attribute here. And I think there should be a fall off somewhere. Here we go. So we can control the distance at which that attribute travels, and we can use this to control the fall off. Cool. Next we have another point VOP, and we're noising those attributes up with these flow noises. Just fitting those ranges, and we're exporting fuel, density, and temperature. And like we had earlier, we're multiplying this down, and we're just plugging that into the flow, so the noise will flow over our character slowly with this one at the default speed on. No, they've both been slowed down by 0.3. I think we should visualize that by just running another flipbook. I'm just going to pause quickly. So with this flipbook generated, we can see exactly what that flow noise is doing to our attributes. we're getting this really nice fiery type of base pattern on top of our character. And we're exporting those attributes out as our attributes that we're going to use inside our simulation. And if I just jump back into Houdini over here, and here we're deleting everything but the fuel, and we're setting down a color, and here we have deleting everything but our temperature, setting down a color, and here we have our emit 1 and 2, those two together, which we're going to rename to density at some point. And if I just merge these together, I've transformed them out so we can see them side by side. And these are going to be our attributes. So this is our fuel, this is our temperature, and this is going to be our density. So let's prepare that emit 1 and 2 for density. So here we're just saying emit 1 and 2 is equal to the density, and of course we can then prepare those attributes by rasterizing the density, fuel, and temperature. And here we just bind exporting the vel fuel as V. So if we merge that together, you can see we have density, fuel, temperature, and V. Cache that out to disk. This visibility is just, we're hiding all those other attributes except for the density. Without that visibility node, we have all the attributes just layered up on top of each other. So I use a visibility node to just hide everything but the density. From there, we're going to dive into our main DOP network. This is where we do all our pyro simulations. So of course, the main thing we need is these three things: is our smoke object, our smoke solver, and our volume source nodes. So this smoke object, it just controls the resolution of our simulation. We have that here. This is the maximum domain of our simulation. The pyro solver is what calculates our simulation. As you can see under shape, we're not using any microsolvers built within this node, but we are adding a few up top. Here we're reading in our velocity, just a portion of that. Our fuel to temperature, but we're not using that. Fuel to flame, set to 1. Density set to 1. And here we're reading in the outer vel. And we're going to add a few microsolvers. Of course, down here we have a ground plane so that no smoke goes beneath and it collides with the ground. Here we have a dissipate node, which sort of kind of like evaporates our density. A gas turbulent node to create some breakups in our simulation, give it more of that fiery explosion type look, and our turbulence also breaking up our simulation. And here we have a gas field VOP reading in out vel back into the second input. So if we take that volume sample, that I believe it's out vel back, we're reading in this here. And we just adding a portion of that to our current velocity and exporting that as well. From there, we need to import our simulation for caching. So we have a DOP import fields. That's just reading in this DOP network. So if we come up here, that's reading in here. Of course, the smoke object, which is this node here. And we're deleting everything but the velocity. We're putting down a process to save some disk space by converting it to 16 float and converting it to VDB, although I believe it is already VDB. Just to be sure, we have that ticked on. blast node once again. And here we have all our other attributes. So we're deleting the velocity here. We have the velocity cache to disk here. Although we deleting it once again and merging it in here, I suppose this is unnecessary. You could just not delete, not merge that in. And we're caching that out to disk once again. And here we have the velocity. So should you want to use it, we could always just merge it back in using a merge node, as we have the velocity separate to other things. Just sometimes you don't need the velocity for rendering, and if you don't have the velocity in your pyro cache, you're gonna save some disk space, some overhead, and you might get a faster render. And if we come down here, we have a volume visualization node, and we can control the look of it by just increasing our density. Under emission, we can read in the temperature, and it's got some sort of black body type ramp here. And here we can control how much fire we see in our visualization. But some say this is the old way of visualizing volumes, and we have this new pyro bake node, which we can. It's almost like doing shading in SOPs. In fact, you can generate a shader using this node. So here we're reading it's similar to this, but we can process our volumes a bit. And so we have the scatter, which is responsible for this it looks like indirect illumination. And so if I untick that, you can see we've got this glowy effect that it's adding here. And here we have our density, and we're just coloring the smoke a bit. If I untick that, we just have our fire. And of course here we have our fire. Under bindings, you can see the attributes that it's reading in. So it's taking in the density, it's taking in the temperature for the scatter, and the temperature for the temperature. And if we want to, you can even come here and you can create a material, which will basically, it'll create a shader for us based on our settings in this pyro bake node. It's very useful if you want to render with Karma or Mantra. So if I just generate a flipbook quickly, we can have a quick preview of what our simulation is going to look like. So I've generated a flipbook quickly, and if we have a look here, this is the result we've got. We have this vortex sort of look coming from the cross product and velocities. We have particles swirling around that we're using as our density. And this is the sort of look that we get from this current setup. But Igor, Zanic at Rebelway thought it would be cooler if we ran an additional flip simulation, and we added the result of that flip simulation into a second pyro simulation, and that would give us more of a gasoline type of look. So we're going to build that next. So if we move on to the flip simulation part of our tutorial, this is where we have the volume cache, and remember we had this velocity separated out. Here we're merging it in with our vel, and well, here we're merging it in with our density and temperature. So if we click on the information on this node, we can see we have the density, temperature, and the vel. Here we're reading in our character, and we're preparing a rest attribute. So if we add any noises to our character, which we will be doing, the character is not going to swim through that noise pattern. Here we're just subdividing, we're peaking our character a bit, and here we're blasting everything but the temperature, and we're transferring that temperature onto our character over here with this attribute from volume. From there we have a point VOP, and we're reading in our temperature. We've got a fit range, and here we are exposing these two parameters so we can change them here. We have that rest attribute into the position of our turbulent noise, which is just going to ensure that our noise stays on our character. We can visualize that quickly here. And as you can see, that noise pattern sticks to our character and he doesn't swim through it. Without that rest attribute, he would swim through that noise. So if I'm just going to plug that back. And we are exporting that to the temp mask attribute. This ramp we're just using for visualization purposes. Here we're scattering points. Here we have 40,000 points scattered on that temp mask. And here we're using a noise and exporting it as velocity. And that's going to give us some very randomized velocities. If I click on this velocity trail here, we can see that those particle velocities are sort of spiking out everywhere. Here we're putting down an attribute delete node, and we're deleting everything but the V. So as you can see, the color information has now gone, and we just have velocity on those points. From there, we're transforming our character up. Sometimes you need to scale simulations up for flip fluids. And in this second input, we have our velocity. We have the vel coming from here. And if I dive, before I dive inside, we need to look at our collisions. So here we have our character. This subnet is just cleaning up some attributes. And here we have a collision source node, which is going to prepare a sign distance field over here. Of course, we're transforming up. This is an SDF field, and this is going to be our geometry. So with that, we can dive inside to the flip solver. Here, of course, we have the static object, which is reading in that VDB set to volume sample, and the SOP path is reading in here. We have a pop drag, which is just going to, make our particles feel more weighted, a bit more like water. A speed, a pop speed force that's going to limit the speed. Anything traveling faster than 15, it's going to be limited. We've got a pop fluid node. We've got pop advect by volume, and that's reading in our second context geometry. So the velocity is being manipulated by the second context geometry. Here we have our pop source, which is reading our first context geometry, and our flip solver, which is going to calculate the water movement. So with a DOP import fields, we're reading in that flip solver, and we're caching to disk. I now have that flip simulation cached to disk. And typically when you do a flip cache, you want to put down a particle fluid surface node to visualize what's happening. And if I set this to particles and we visualize the velocity, we can see we have this flip simulation. But since we're not doing water, we're doing fire, we have this attribute VOP here, and we're reading in the length of the velocity, we're fitting that range, and we bind exporting that as flame. Here we have a ramp just so we can visualize it, pretty similar to what we have here. So we're using this point VOP to visualize those attributes as we would with a particle fluid surface. From there, we're transforming that back down. Here we're clamping the X compressor, so the R of our CD, and we're exporting that as density. And of course, we're going to rasterize the density, flame, and V. So we have our flip simulation as volumes. And if I look at our attributes, we have density, flame, and V. Pretty cool. And if we come over here, we have our second pyro simulation. So if we dive inside, it's, I believe, a copy of our first DOP simulation. Just an exact same copy. But this time, we have a third volume source. And this is going to read in the attributes that we prepared from our flip simulation. So it's taking the V and it's piping that to vel at 1, flame into the flame, and the density into density. And we're just adding half of that density back into the simulation. And if we cache that out as we did before using a DOP import node, we isolating the velocity, and if we come over to our pyro flip cache and we put down a pyro bake node as we did once before, we can now visualize our second simulation, this time driven by flip. So let's just run a flip book. So here we have a flip book of our final effect, and I must say it looks pretty awesome. This, I mean, we've got this gasoline look. Look how this almost looks like gravity is taking hold of the fluid, and that fluid is burning up and evaporating and bursting out into flames, and it's just such a dynamic effect. If we compare it with the standard pyro simulation, the standard pyro simulation is good on its own, but with this added flip fluid being read in by the volume source, you can just see how I mean, it really does look like a gasoline fire. Where's this? Not so much. It's cool, definitely cool. You could do some cool fire effects with that. It looks, you know, this guy looks like he's made out of wood or something and he's being burnt. This guy really looks like he's got petrol swirling around him. And of course, we showed how to make that vortex by using the cross product. We've prepared emitters, different attributes, and run a flip simulation and 2 pyro simulations. So I'm very interested to see what you guys come up with. Maybe you could use the cross product tool to make a completely new effect, or you could use this to make some sort of dragon breathing fire, a fire tornado. The possibilities are endless. So we have these amazing renders that Saber has prepared for us. So I'm going to hand over to Saber, who's going to take you through the lighting, shading, and rendering for this project.
So let's talk about shading and rendering this effects using Houdini and Arnold. And this is the final sequence for the main shot, and this is the raw render without any compositing on it. So let's take a look at the workflow. And what I've done is I have my sim here. I'm going to use the Pyro Bake tool, which is a very awesome tool that will help us get some nice scattering effects on the node on the sim. So I'm just going to drop the node and go under scatter, turn it on, and this is going to use the temperature field and generate a blurry version off of it to give it some nice glowy look. And I'm going to turn off masking. This is going to multiply it by the density. I don't want that in this case because this is a large scale effects. I'm going to trim or use a small section of the of the temperature. Instead of 0 to 1, I'm going to use 0.5 to 5 and expand the range because my temperature, let's go to 10. My temperature is a bit high, and I'm going to lower this to 50. Let's try 10. Yeah, something like that. And let's add the actual temperature. This is just the glow from the temperature. So I'm going to turn on fire, and I'm going to tick on compute range in one of the frames, and that will basically go check the min and max of that field. I'm going to lower this to 1 and 10. And I'm going to remap it a bit. And let me turn off the scatter so we can see it. So right now it's too uniform. I just want some, sparks or like bright spots kept from this. So I'm going to move this point to the center, and I'm going to remap my temperature field to only appear when it's super hot at the center. So everything else is going to be black. And let's turn on the scatter back. I think it's still too much, but let's turn on the scatter back. Yeah, I think this is good. And let's play with the color of the smoke itself. So the actual smoke color is going to have a brown tint. And also the shadow color, even though this is not going to affect the final render, it's just for preview purpose, I think it helps quite a bit. And let me turn off the scatter and the fire so we can see it better. And here, just playing with the shadow color, you can see I'm getting some cool results and hue shift in the shadows. So we'll go with this. And the trick is this node is doing a lot of calculation under the hood, and to match this exact colors in the render, regardless of which one it is, it's going to be tricky, and you have to reapply the exact same value in order to get this to look perfectly. But there's a trick for this. So right now we have temperature and scatter, so two float fields, and scatter is actually a vector. Should be a float, but in this case it's a vector. So all I need is the final color information. I don't need these two fields. So under binding, there's this bake emission volume. And if you take it on, it's going to bake all this beautiful information into a channel called CE. And I can blast and remove any unnecessary data. So the temperature and scatter, I don't need them anymore. And let's see. Delete unselected. Yeah, so all those fields I don't need anymore. And now we have the just the density and CE, and we can use a visualization node, and this is what the render or the shader is going to do at render time. I'm going to use the density and set it to 10, and then under emission I'm going to set this to 1, and we'll use the CE, or we can use density, and then I'm going to use CE as the color and turn off and say no ramp. It's a good approximation. It's not exactly the same, but in the render we will be able to plug this in and use it. So all we need is the density and CE off of this, and that's what I've done in this node. And this is the final results, very similar to what we've done, just less intense. And then I removed the scatter and the density and wrote this to disk. Now this makes things a lot easier when rendering the scene, and I swapped the scene file to the final rendering scene. And what I have here is I have three things. I have the character. I have four things. I have the character geometry, which I haven't used, just for visualization purpose. And then I have the eyes, and this is just two spheres that I exported, or 2 points that I exported, each one for each eye, and it will allow me to parent light to it. So left eye is called A, and right eye is called B. So I have 2 points. Each one is grouped. Each one point is in a group. And then I can use a Rivet Node. So just create a Rivet Node, and this works with pretty much anything in Houdini. I'm gonna drag the SOP node and then pick the group. And here now, if we put a rubber toy or anything and parent it, let's make it smaller, it's gonna match that rivet all the time. So that's how I'm parenting two lights, and this is a point light, and it's called A and B. Right, next I have the actual effects, and I cached out the disk as a VDB sequence, and now I'm reading it in. Let's go to frame 48. I'm reading it in, and I'm making sure that I import density and CE. And in the material, all we have to do is this. We create a standard volume, connect that, and then create a volume sample RGB, because that's what the data is stored as, and then the name is CE, and this goes into the emission color. Okay, and then for the emission actual value, I'm going to compute the length of this field, and that's going to give me basically the luminance of it, and that goes into the emission. And here I'm adding a multiplier in case I need to multiply the intensity or the amount of fire I have. I can use this. Then inside the shader, this is the default shader. Inside the shader, I'm just going to change it to, let me check, yeah, to channel, and I'm going to clean this, remove it, because all my data is coming through this. That's it. Set the density color to 10, density value to 10. The color, we give it a small tint, and then the transparency, we also give it a small tint to get some hue shifting. I'm going to go back to my original shader, and let me go to the lights. So I have two lights, 2 point light, one for each eye, and then I have a sunlight and a skylight. Let me reduce this. So this is the skylight, no texture, just a orange color, and this is the sun. And I'm going to go to the out context, and I'm going to import the smoke effects storm, and the grid, the camera, all the lights, and I'm going to go to the APR and hit render. And it should start rendering the character very, very soon. And for the final render, I turned on the indirect or the volume scatter. I set it to 2 bounces, so I get some nice illumination off of the fire. And I'm going to change this to volume indirect, and this is the illumination of the fire. You can see it here. So I have AUVs for each light. This is the eye left, eye right, sky, sun, and volume direct. This is all the volume direct illumination, and this is the volume indirect. And then we have the emission as well. So this is the actual temperature or the emission field. And this is the result of the indirect scatter from that field. It's very easy in Arnold to set light AUVs. All you have to do is go to the light itself and give it a name under the AUV light group. Give it a string here. And then under the out, you create an RGBA channel, and then you give it the name of the light AUV group, and that will simply give you an AUV. So that's all there is here. RGB eye left, right, sun, sky, and then volume direct and indirect and emission. So that's pretty much it. Using the pyrobake, saving that as CE, reading that in, and then assigning the shader to the geometry and rendering the full sequence. Thank you so much for watching. Talk to you soon.